Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone who's been able to join us and who's online on Teams. I'm Will Roulette, the Deputy Director for the Educational Foundation. So thank you for joining us. I'm going to turn the mic over to the NAUGUS and NGF President, Major General Retired Francis McGinn.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to NAUGUS Memorial Building. Welcome to the, inappropriately, the Sonny Montgomery boardroom, where our board of directors conduct all their meetings and other events like this. I just want to say thanks to Will, Luke, and Kevin, putting this, the third now in the series of book reviews that we've done. It's a new initiative taken from the foundation on how we tell the Guard story. So this is just another way of how we do that. And then also a welcome to Dr. Wiest. And looking forward to his remarks, and also Dr. Paul Lyons as well from USM. So great partnership we have with them, and we look forward to the future with the university. So without any further ado, I'm going to interview my predecessor and colleague and friend, Major General Retired Roy Robinson, and he is featured in the book, as we all know. So I'm going to introduce it over to Roy to introduce Dr. Wiest, and we'll get this thing going. Roy?
Thank you, Frank. I appreciate you. So. I've really gotten to know Dr. Wiest. He's initially I didn't know Andy that well, although I went to USM. I spent an inordinate amount of time at USM for an undergraduate student, so I should have known more people than I did, but I didn't know Andy. But I had gotten to know him very well. Andy's got, number one, he really is a well-known military history author with an unbelievable reputation. What he does is he just has a unique approach to telling stories. And I think when you look into the book, you're going to see what I'm talking about. He was recently recognized, make sure I get this right, the Samuel Eliot Morrison Prize from the Society of the Military History for Lifetime Scholarly Achievement. And if you go back and look at his bio and everything that's out there on the internet as far as Andy Wiest, he wrote The Boys of '67, which is a really well-known book that he was a part of. But he's also wrote several books. That's 28? 22. And he's been quite the contributor, and this is his first real adventure into, I think, the National Guard to the level that he is on this particular book. I couldn't be prouder than to be associated with what Andy's done. He actually, over the course of what he's put into writing the book, getting to know all the people of the 150th, I got to say, he's the closest thing to a member of the National Guard out there that's not actually worn our uniform before. He understands our world. He understands our culture. And there's something that I think most people don't realize that is a really, really big part of the center down at Southern Miss. We want to capture all the history. We want to be able for people to go in and go through the catalog and be able to find things about the National Guard that were historically pretty hard to kind of dig through. But there's another part to this that's the more personal part that I think you'll hear Andy convey. And it's really about the way that he's done this. Most of, where's Jacob at? So there's some soldiers that are a part of the folks here that are going through the tour at DC that were actually in Dogwood in Iraq when we were there. And, you know, they were all very young when we were there. It's been a long time ago. I was younger, much younger. And there's a lot of guys and women that were in their 18 to 23-year-old kind of world. We had multiple brothers. We had father sons. And all those service members that go through that kind of deal that we went through that year in Anbar province in Iraq, they bottle all this stuff up. And some of them manage it better. Some of them, as we get older, we digest some of the things that went on, some of the things that we went through. There are others who actually need to be able to get it out. And they're not going to go see a formal healthcare person for that. They keep it all bottled up, and there's nothing better for that than for them to sit down and have somebody on the other side of the table listen to their oral history and let them talk through everything that they went through over a 2 or 3 day period with somebody not questioning it, not commenting back. They're just listening to their oral history. Tell us what it looked like to you from your perspective. We've been looking for a long time on ways to prevent young men and women that have served in the uniform from doing things that are really, really bad and getting in a position where they take their own lives. It's been a really difficult thing to address. I personally believe, and Andy knows this, I honestly believe that that's just another facet that we don't talk about very often of the oral history program. Yes, we gather a lot of information. It makes for great books. Andy's going to write some more. It makes a great history for people to go in and look at the things that the National Guard have done specifically during that surge period in Iraq. But the thing that we don't talk about, and people who haven't been through it don't realize, it is therapeutical for all the kids that did their duty at that time and place. And I say kids because they may have been 20 or 22 years old then, but now they're 40 and 50 years old. And some of them still haven't had the opportunity to sit down. It's not something you sit down and tell your wife about, you know what I mean? They haven't had the opportunity to sit down and just get it out, have that discussion. And in this kind of environment, I really believe that it's kind of an added benefit that we're not able to measure, but I'm pretty comfortable in saying that it's made a pretty big difference in a lot of soldiers' lives that were involved in specifically this rotation. So for that, Andy, I thank you, and I won't have anything else. I want to listen to what you're going to say about this.
Thank you, sir. And I apologize in advance for having to sit down for this whole thing, but I threw my back out. Welcome to being 65. So, pleased to have a lot of special people in the audience today, ranging from students from the past to, of course, all the wonderful folks at the National Guard Educational Foundation who are here. But, of course, we also have some members of the 223rd Engineers who are part of Joint Task Force Magnolia here, who are serving in D.C. right now. But perhaps most importantly for the way this book runs, we do have Roy Robinson, who commanded the unit I'm writing about. We have Paul Lyon, who was one of the company commanders of the unit you're going to be hearing about. We have Jacob Thomas, who was there at Dogwood as well. But let's not forget, we've also got Jane Lyon, because the families at home, in many ways, were as much of a veteran of this conflict as the soldiers who fought in it, especially given what happened to the Mississippians in 2005. Thought I'd begin by inflicting upon you some of the writing itself. So a short reading from the book, if you happen to have it, it starts on page 185, and not to give too much away, but there's the subheading there is tragedy. On June 11th, Bravo's company's task was to head to a village in the northern part of the area of operations that just wasn't visited, given the constant need to keep a wary eye on the insurgent-dominated village of Owasat. Since his unit didn't often go to this location, Captain Paul Lyon reasoned that there might be a discovery of a cache. So on this day, the public affairs officer, Danny Blanton, and a cameraman accompanied Bravo Company, hoping to take some pictures and develop a write-up on whatever was found. Normally, Asim, one of the unit's interpreters, rode with Lyon on such missions, but since the PAO and cameraman were in the vehicle, Asim was going to have to ride in one of the other 113s. For Asim, that wasn't a problem at all. He made a beeline for the 113 that was going to carry his friends, Larry Arnold and Terrence Lee. He loved talking to those guys, so it was going to be a great day. For his part, Larry Arnold wasn't even supposed to be on the mission. The platoon leader, Lieutenant Mike Beal, had taken Arnold's name off the list from that day. Arnold was older, he was 46, and Beal kind of figured that he could use some rest after having gone on a long, grueling mission the day before, but Arnold told Beal that he was good to go. He wanted to go do his duty, just like everybody else. So Larry Arnold talked his way back onto that mission. A tanker who was attached to the unit, John Vocho, led the way in his tank, followed by Lyon's Humvee, and then 3 M113s. Lyon got on the radio to Vocho to remind him the route north would be through the desert and that he was to take care not to cross tracks left in the sand by any previous patrol. That's where the insurgents just love to bury IEDs. Vocho responded in the affirmative, and the convoy headed out. As the patrol made its way north, Vocho couldn't help but feel sorry for the guys driving behind his tank. His treads and the huge turbine engine of the tank turned up quite a bit of dust in its wake. And on a hot, windy day like today, those guys are going to be covered in sand. In the northern villages, there turned out to be really nothing of interest. I searched a few houses, talked to some women and children about why their husbands weren't there, and the usual. No caches were found, just a boring day. On the way back to Dogwood, which was their fob, the patrol went on a different route because it had been assigned a new counter-mortar mission. In Lieutenant Beale's M113, Beale stood in the gunner's position while Michael Martin was driving and David Landrum was sitting by his side. Arnold and Lee were seated far in the back, staying as far away as they could from the incoming sand. Asim was seated just a bit further forward. The day was coming to an end, and dinner and a rest were on their minds. When Beale looked back, he saw Lee and Arnold both fast asleep. It had been another long, hot day with little to show for it. Driving through the desert meant dealing with hills, and Vocho's tank, with its greater power, was pulling a bit further ahead every time they went up a hill. Then Vocho started up a particularly large hill, and Lyon made ready to call him to slow him down just a bit. The tank could plow straight forward and was doing exactly what it was supposed to do, avoiding the tracks of previous patrols. But this hill was so steep that Lyon's driver had to veer outside the tank's tracks to make his way up the hill, and the rest of the patrol then followed. In so doing, the Humvee crossed the tracks of a previous patrol. Lyon couldn't help but shudder. Nothing happened. Luck seemed to be with them. But then when the M113 carrying Arnold, Lee, and Asim reached that spot, there was a huge explosion. Mike Beale didn't even have time to register the blast or heat or anything. He just went flying through the air, having been blown out of the gunner's turret of the M113. He landed on the hood of the stricken vehicle with a thud, knocked out. The patrol came to a quick halt. Everybody was taking care. Where the insurgents placed one IED, they often placed others. Lyon, along with Marty Davis, turned to look from their Humvee and saw sand and smoke rising from the M113, but it hadn't been torn to shreds like in previous attacks. Maybe everybody was okay. Quickly, a defensive perimeter was formed, and the rescuers rushed back to the stricken vehicle. Among the first to the scene were Lyon, Davis, and Vocho, along with the medic, Joseph Smith. They could hardly believe the scene that awaited them there. Atop the vehicle lay Beale, shaking uncontrollably. He seemed almost in a fog, but quickly recognized Lyon and the others who were running up, even though to him they seemed to be moving in slow motion. He shook his head to clear the massive cobwebs further and joined the search of the vehicle. The explosion, caused by a 115 millimeter artillery shell hooked to a pressure plate, had gone off directly under the rear quarter of the 113 and would have thrown shrapnel all through the vehicle, killing everyone. But weeks before at Dogwood, the M113 had been augmented with hillbilly armor, a 5-inch thick steel plate welded beneath the rear of the vehicle where the troops rode. That plate had held the shrapnel at bay, but its welds had given way, bending the steel upward with massive crushing force. First, the group found David Landrum, whose leg was crushed below the knee and was dangling at an odd angle. He was in horrific pain, but he would survive. Smith and Vocho then attempted to open the back door of the 113, but the crumpling armor had jammed it. Next, they scrambled to the top hatch, where they were able to reach Arnold and Lee. Mike Beale joined in, but felt all the strength leave his body. once he saw the scene. The massive force of the blast had crushed much of Lee's skull and blown off one of his legs. Smith took grim solace that Terrence Lee, that constantly smiling presence, had died instantly, never knowing a moment of fear or pain. Larry Arnold almost certainly had a broken neck. He had all his teeth blown out and had a host of other broken bones, but he was still breathing. The men, though, could not reach a scene. The mangled armor didn't allow them access to him through the top hatch, but they knew that he was in there. So Vocho crawled over to the emergency hatch and opened it, and there was a seam. The crumpled armor had pinned the lower part of his body. He didn't have a pulse that Vocho could feel, and although he figured it was useless given the state of the armor, he gave Asim's body a tug to see if it could be pulled free. He was surprised when the body moved easily, and when he got Asim through the escape hatch, he discovered why. Asim's legs had been shorn off above the knee by the force of the armor's crumpling. After placing Asim on the ground, Vocho went back into the vehicle to retrieve his legs. Two were KIA, and Larry Arnold was in deep critical condition. With the perimeter set up, Lyon put out the call for a medevac chopper. Hopefully Arnold could be saved, but it was plain that he had massive internal injuries and was having a great trouble breathing. Hoping against all hope to buy Arnold time, Smith performed an emergency tracheotomy, allowing Arnold to breathe more freely, but he turned to Lyon and told him that chopper had better get there soon. He didn't know how much more time Arnold had. But Lyon could hardly believe it. The damn choppers from Baghdad were hemming and hawing about coming. There was a sandstorm brewing, and they thought that the landing area might be hot and under fire. Lyon was nearly frantic. Time was the most precious commodity, and he knew it, and those choppers were wasting it. Should Arnold be placed in another vehicle and taken back to Dogwood? Just then the news arrived. The choppers were inbound, but 20 minutes had been lost. The men set up a landing zone for the chopper, but it landed nearly 500 feet away from where the casualties were. The chopper carried a doctor from Baghdad who got out to assess a situation. Asim and Lee had passed, so they weren't his issue. He went straight to Larry Arnold, who still had Joseph Smith kneeling at his side. The doctor took Arnold's pulse on his fingertip and, finding none, pronounced him dead. Medevac choppers were for the living, not for the dead, so Arnold would have to be loaded up along with Asim and Lee and taken back by vehicle to Dogwood. Smith looked up and told that doctor that Arnold did have a pulse, but it needed to be checked at the neck. It might be faint, but it was still there. Lyon and Smith both pled with the doctor, and Lyon was pretty sure that some of the guys in his unit were ready to beat that doctor's ass if he didn't comply. Checking Arnold's neck did indicate a faint pulse, so the doctor got to work at a frenetic pace, and Arnold was soon placed aboard the chopper and was off to Baghdad. Not too long, though, after Lyon received the call over the radio, Larry Arnold had died on the flight to the hospital. As a historian that's written an awful lot about men and women in wartime, golly, when was it? About 10 years ago now, I got to thinking that I ought to write write a book about my own local unit. In this case, the nearest unit was the 150th Engineers, Combat Engineers, based largely in Loosedale and Meridian and other places across the state. And that's what this book is about. It's about who they were. It's about who they grew up being. It's about how they joined the Guard. It's about what happened to them after they've come home as well. But the heart of the book is that 1 year deployment to Iraq in 2005. There's, in my mind, some concern about what the story isn't. As an author, probably the general was kind enough to bring it up. The biggest book I've written was The Boys of 67 about a combat company in Vietnam. And that was turned into a documentary and stuff like that. But the chief negative criticism of that book was that there's so many people in it, because the combat company has about 160 guys. There's so many people in it, they're hard to keep straight. So there is the conundrum facing somebody like me who wants to write a book about the National Guard, in this case in 2005. Everybody needs a story told. The Louisiana unit that was there at the same time, actually predating a little bit the Mississippi deployment. The Tennessee unit that was there in the same time, the National Guard made up about 50% of our troops on the ground in 2005. And every one of those units needs their story told. Certainly the wider Mississippi 155 Armor Brigade needs its story told. But in attempting to tell every story, you're likely to tell none. You're likely to write a book that's 8,000 pages long and isn't going to flow well. So sadly enough, what I had to choose to do was still narrow it down, but we're still talking a battalion of guys, which most of the time while they were over there was a little bit over 200. So certainly there are going to be readers complaining, even though I left a lot of the National Guard out, that there's still too many people in here to keep track of. So that's going to be your difficulty as a reader if you decide to tackle this book, keeping those names straight. But there is a glossary at the end for you to check that out. Gotta look and see what maps are behind me. The 150th is we're the combat engineer element of the 155 Armored Brigade. To put it really simply, they spent, how many months y'all spend training up, Paul?
So year.
Somewhere in the neighborhood of a year training up, both at Camp Shelby, which some of you might have been to, and then at the National Training Center out in California. This book certainly covers that. They were going to go to Iraq and do what combat engineers do, which in Iraq was going to be setting up defenses on FOBs or FOBs. Also, if there's any case where you have to take on a fortified place, get rid of those defenses that the enemy might have. So the 150 trained for every mission possible, but a lot of their training in their run-up was, of course, for the mission that they expected to face. But if you look here on this map, you're going to see the FOBs that are occupied by the 155 during its service in Iraq, largely in Babel and Anbar provinces over there. Once the Mississippians got to Kuwait, they found out a problem. They were able to look around the staging areas there and see that while they had unarmored Humvees and M113s, the Army was driving in slicker gear than that. The Army was largely driving those up-armored vehicles. It had been just 2 months before the Mississippians arrived that a Tennessee National Guardsman had famously confronted Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense at the time, and about not having the proper equipment. And Rumsfeld had replied, "You go to war with the army you have, not the army you wish you had." But the Mississippians were going to roll into Iraq without the best equipment possible. But it didn't worry them too much. They're going to be doing, in this case, engineer duties at FOBs pretty much over the south and western part of Iraq. They were going to make do as they always did. And the forward detachments of the units of the 150 spread out to all of these bases. And that's when the call came in. The Marines were having a tough time in Anbar. If you know, this is the beginning of 2005. At the very end of 2004 had been a fun little dust-up in Fallujah that had bloodied the insurgents in Iraq pretty badly. Those insurgents had fled to a number of other cities in Iraq, the surviving insurgents, and those cities had caught on fire. Notably, the city that is going to be the central part of what my guys deal with, which is the small village of Owasat. So the Marines, this is a very kinetic year for them. They're going to need more help than they thought they needed. Specifically, they're going to need one more FOB taken over by the Mississippians, FOB out in the geographic middle of nowhere, which is called FOB Dogwood. The Mississippians didn't have a spare infantry unit laying around. So the news came in to Robinson and the rest of the guys at the 150th that you're not going to be combat engineers during your year. You're going to own your own area of operations at a place called FOB Dogwood. The guys knew so little about FOB Dogwood that the main convoy going there got lost. That's how much information they had on the place. So although every engineer unit trains for an infantry role, it wasn't the main thing they trained for. They were not trained for this specific area, and they didn't have the weapons at hand to undertake the job they've been given. So the 150th, if you play cards, has a 7-2 offsuit in their hand, and it's going to be a difficult hand to play. Let's make things even worse. FOB Dogwood lies in an area of Iraq called the Triangle of Death, which shouldn't give you a whole lot of warm fuzzies about hearing that name when you're about to go there. It's about 15 miles from Baghdad, similarly about 15 miles from Fallujah. When Baghdad had fallen in 2003, this is where the bad guys had buried all their weapons caches. This is where the bad guys were digging them up. The small village of Owasat is where those weapons were drugged to, and then they were shipped out via the Euphrates River all over the country. So these guys are being plopped down on the insurgents' breadbasket. It's the insurgents' supply area, and they're sure as hell not going to give it up easy. About 200 guys, give or take, is what they show up at FOB Dogwood with. And they're going to own a physical area of operations bigger than the geographic size of New York City. And they're going to own an area of operations with about 70,000 civilians in it, spread out all over the place, shot through with how many members of Al-Qaeda that wanted them dead. Nobody knows that. So these Mississippians, I would argue, and it's common to what the National Guard is facing in 2005, is walking into a very difficult situation without without much of what they need to do the job right. But of course, the Mississippians are going to get the job done like the National Guard always does. Sean Cooley was everybody's favorite guy in the unit. He didn't have to be there. He was a nurse at Singing River Hospital on the coast. He was going to go train for nurse anesthetist training as well, which could have got him out of Iraq. He also hurt himself at NTC, which he didn't tell anybody about. But Sean Cooley was not going to miss but being over there with his guys. On the second day, when the unit is at FOB Dogwood, Sean Cooley had been on the first patrol that day and certainly did not need to be on the second patrol that day, but he knew that a friend of his who was going to be the gunner in the 113 that day, actually it was a Humvee that day, he was having a tough time, and Sean wanted to be there for his buddy. So the guy driving the Humvee was getting ready to move out, and Sean said, "No, I'm driving today." And you don't turn Sean Cooley down. On the way out of the FOB, Sean's vehicle hit a 115 pressure-plated artillery shell, went off directly under his seat, ejected him from the vehicle, traumatically amputating both of his legs, crushing his skull on the way through the top of the vehicle. It's one of those moments that you know that the year's not going to be kind to you. Most of what I wrote was through the eyes of interviews with the soldiers. I was able to interview Stacy Ford, who was sitting in the seat next to Sean, the medic who was sitting behind him. Getting those stories is incredibly painful. I was able to interview Sean's parents as well as his wife to be able to add more depth to who he is. And by the way, those are the hardest interviews you're gonna do. Sean's dad, Jerry Cooley, our interview with him was 2 or 3 hours at his home, and he wore dark glasses, was the only surrender he was going to make to emotion. And he did get up twice to make a pot of coffee during the interview. That was his method of getting out of the room. I made sure Paul was there for that interview because I knew how difficult that was going to be. Because we were just about to cover Sean's loss and how they found out about it. And he came back in the room diligently, having made his coffee, and Paul rightfully told him, what Sean had meant to the unit, how many lives he'd saved in the unit, what he meant to everybody. And Jerry gave me the quote of all the quotes that I have in this book. He said, "That's well and good, I appreciate that, but I would live under a bridge and eat out of a hook out if I could see that boy one more time." So this book is certainly about what the Guard did and why it did it and how things came out, but it's also about the humans that served in it. The 150th commander, sitting right over there, Roy Robinson, he realized he's got a problem, a big problem. He's going to need tanks. He swaps a platoon of engineers to get a platoon of tanks, and that's going to change a lot. That's why Voce was there, and I'm able to quote about him from later. To me, one of the more interesting things he does too is he realizes that the National Guard is a family. It's not quite like a regular Army unit. These guys grew up together. They're dating each other's, sisters. They play each other in football. They babysat the other's brother. These guys are family, and that's a great strength of the National Guard. It also is a great difficulty when you lose somebody. So Robinson went against all the books, and I hope I don't get you in trouble by saying this, but I say it a lot. He called them a combat stress specialist, Rosalind Morris, who was, and she is great, one of the best interviews I've ever done. She is 3 or 4 things that nobody at Fob Dogwood wanted. She was a stray lieutenant colonel, she was a head doctor, and she was a she. There's a whole bunch of things. These guys they might talk to each other a little bit and keep up their John Wayne kind of barriers between it, but they're sure as hell not going to talk to her. So she came up with a couple of really interesting ways of dealing with it. And by the way, she's still deeply in touch with the unit. She goes to Jackson and visits people who are running in the name of Sean Cooley. She became one of their family, even though she was a regular Army. She came up with 2 gambits about how to get the men to reach out to her. First, she's going to teach them all how not to smoke. So she called people in her little tent through the guise of smoking cessation. And Paul tells this wonderful story. He could always tell when somebody had been, they called her Psycho 6, that was her call sign. He could always tell when somebody had been to go see Psycho 6 because they had a cigar hanging out their mouth and a nicotine patch on. Because they just used smoking cessation as a cover to get in there and talk about what they were going through. And the other thing she suggested was that she wanted to go out on missions with the guys, which was strictly a no-no. She did go out on missions with the guys. She got blown up one day with Paul by an IED, but wasn't physically injured, but wound up winning the CAB, correct? So that's what the National Guard does. As you also well know, it thinks outside the box. Ain't going to take no for an answer. But everybody knew what the problem was. If you look on this map, right out here in the bend in the river, that's the insurgent-dominated village of Owasso. That's where the bad guys are at, 100%. Everybody knows it. However, Dogwood itself is about 5 kilometers out into the desert, which is about as topographically varied as this table. So every time you're driving to Owasso, they know you're coming. And the men jump in the Euphrates or get into little boats they've made and get across the river and out of the AO. And even though there were helicopters along, the helicopters, of course, did not have the standard ability to shoot at these guys. So whenever the 150th showed up at the area it knew was killing them, there was nothing there but women who had no idea where their husbands were. They must be out at Walmart shopping or something like that, or maybe in the Iraqi army. But the men were never there. So what we get for the first few months is this game of cat and mouse, because Robinson, frankly, doesn't have the combat troops he needs to be able to go out and deal with an AO this big or that many civilians. The Mississippians are doing good to survive until this point. That's until June the 11th, 2005. I read you the account of what happened on that day. But the people from that day are emblematic of what the Guard is. On the bottom right, that's Larry Arnold, who again is 46. He doesn't need to be there. In fact, Larry Arnold had been in Iraq during the invasion in 2003. He'd already done his duty, but he'd been shipped home for a physical issue, and he felt like his duty wasn't done yet. He felt like he wanted to go back. And he also has a good reason to go back. His son is also in the 150th. He wants to be there to help his son, so it's a father-son unit. His son is actually, he turns up at home on his home leave. He hugs his mama, takes a nap. While he's taking that nap, that he finds out his father had been killed, taking his place in the Humvee while he was going on R&R, something he's still wrestling with quite deeply. Top right is Terrence Lee, another National Guard story. He joined the Guard because he knew his wife Stephanie was pregnant, and he wanted to have a better life for that youngin' named Marchand. He was, again, the smiling guy that everybody loved in the unit. To cap off his story, his wife gives birth to their child, Marchand, in August following his death. She gives birth to the child during Katrina, as Katrina is coming to lay waste to the home that they built with his death benefit. So the tragedy goes on. Asim, the interpreter, somehow he had become an interpreter at 16. When the Mississippians got him, he was 17, and he desperately wanted to go to America to study at a college, and that was the only trouble he had, was the USM people were pushing USM, Mississippi State's pushing that, and on and on. When his parents were alerted to his death, they said, "You're going to have to bury him because he was dead to us the day he joined the Americans." So again, it's a deep National Guard story, who these people were. The Mississippians finally listened to Robinson, who had been ranting and raving the whole time about wanting more combat assets because he knows where the problem's at. So he gets another combat company, Charlie Company, and now with enough combat assets to be able to push out and take the initiative to the enemy. Again, the Mississippians come up with a way to do it that the Army wouldn't have. Because again, the Mississippians, like any other National Guard unit, are full of people who have other jobs by day and learn a lot from those jobs and take them into the field with them. The first thing they do is, because OSI has one road going through it, it runs along the river, they cut that road. They're trying to strangle the insurgency in OSI. Second thing they do is they make outposts that are very either near to the city or near to its supply lines along that road. By the way, Dogpatch is of course named after Dogwood. Bottom Line is named after everybody's favorite hillbilly bar that the Alpha Company used to hang out in. So these guys strangle the insurgency, begin to cut off all trade going into and out of that town. By the way, they're also paving the roads. And who are they paying to pave the roads? The local insurgents who the Iranians are giving money to. We're paying them more. So they're now working for our team, not working for the enemy team. What are these guys doing? They're inventing what Petraeus and Noggle will eventually write down in the coin handbook. The Mississippians are just doing coin off the cuff and doing it well. All this causes one of the local insurgents to change sides. A wonderful guy who's dubbed the Screaming Chicken. by the Mississippians. In the late summer, they run a huge operation into Owasot. This is a nighttime operation. They also finally have permission for the helicopters to shoot at the ones who are trying to cross the river, so they don't cross the river that night, let's put it that way. And on that one night, 150 Al-Qaeda operatives are rounded up in that city. And if you remember the little deck of cards with all the high rollers on there, 5 of them were in that deck of cards. So it is an unimaginable victory running one night. And then they keep on doing it. They keep on running raids into that city, and the next one gets 34, the next one gets 20. By the way, all the time during this, Katrina comes, and that's another story for this unit. The shoe's on the other foot. Usually it's the civilian at home who doesn't know what the man and now woman on the front line are going through, and now it's reversed. All the communications are down. These guys are from the Mississippi Gulf Coast. They have no idea what's happening to their families. It creates a crisis of compassionate leave for these guys, because everybody needs to go home and fix their house. Everybody. But you can't send the whole damn unit home. So navigating that is hard enough. It's late August when Stacy Ford, who has, no, it's not Stacy Ford, it's Larry Merg. I'm not going to, Mergenschroer is his last name, I never can say it. They just call him Merg. He has a really good southern accent, so I'm going to try to do it like he does. He's sitting in Dog Patch, this little outpost one day, and 3 guys in fancy turbans come up with the white flag, and he radioed back, "I got 3 guys in fancy turbans coming up here, should I shoot them?" And the answer to the should I shoot them is no. And Paul rushes out there. Turns out these are the 3 leaders of the Owasot sub-tribe of the Esau tribe, the guys who live in that area, and they are indeed there to surrender. They go back to the base and they say, look, the people are starving because you've cut off contact and trade through this area. The bad guys have left. They moved on to areas that aren't quite so tough, and we're ready to talk turkey. And from then on, once a week, instead of fighting the people of Owasot, since the insurgents have left, the Mississippians are working with them, helping them put in better strains of their crops, helping out with their irrigation. They adopt a school, they adopt the orphanage, they're putting in water filtration systems. From about September to when the Mississippians go home, it's not a violence-free zone, because the bad guys still want this zone. But the Mississippians have done their job so well that one of their chief worries is how many people are going to show up for the MedCap. Everybody shows up for the MedCap. My favorite story from a MedCap. Everybody loved it when the doctor showed up, because this is the first real advanced medicine they've had in a long time. They were a little more worried about the dentist, because most of their dental hygiene was so bad they're going to leave with fewer teeth. Paul was telling me this story about an old man that turned up with 2 teeth, and one of them was infected, and the other one might be iffy too. And the old man told the dentist, "You can't take them both out, or my wife's going to leave me. I got to at least go back with 1." So he left with 1 tooth left in his mouth, and as far as we know, they're still married. But the chief difficulty that the Mississippians now had with the people of Owasot was when they got together once a week, who was going to bring the tea? Because the Iraqis hated iced tea, and the Iraqi tea had a little bit of a trouble interacting with the American digestive system, we'll put it that way. So other than that, the Mississippians have done it. The area is one of the most pacified areas in Iraq. Really should no longer be included, if you ask me, in the triangle of death. Then comes December, time to go home. The year is done. The Marines rotate in to backfill after the Mississippians leave. The Mississippians are going to turn over all the intelligence they've got, all the friends they've made and everything. Marines don't want to hear it. Marines ain't worried about it. In fact, they don't even think Dogwood is worth holding anymore. They closed down the FOB. And the sad part about it is the Mississippians knew exactly what was going to happen. That this area is valuable to the insurgents, and they're going, especially if the Americans aren't there, continuing that relationship. It's going to go back to the insurgency. Was able to do some research. We were able to contact one of the unit's interpreters who still lives over there, was able to tell us what happened. And the story about what happens to this area once the Mississippians leave is pretty sad. The Owasatis were very happy to no longer have Al-Qaeda killing them. So even when the Mississippians left and the Marines didn't stay, they raised a little private army of 200 guys to defend their town. Al-Qaeda wiped that army out and took this area over again. You may be familiar with this area, you may have heard the story, but 2 years after the Mississippians left, it's 2007, there were 3 Americans killed very near to Owasat. At first, they only thought one was killed and the other 2 had been taken captive. And so they're searching for them madly to try to find them. And the search operation is called Operation Marine Courageous. And a whole bunch of troops, mainly regular Army troops, descend on this town. And they have with them Stars and Stripes. They have with them plenty of guys with their TV cameras, and they have with them the LA Times. And if you read the story about these guys going back into this area, all the stories say that they were amazed to see that 3 sheiks came out and wanted to meet them, wanted to talk Turkey. And if you read those stories say that this is the first time that U.S. troops have set foot in Owasat. Of course, the Mississippians who are watching this on television know exactly who those guys were. Those were the same 3 sheiks. They're able to still look on top of the school and see that the water system they put in there is still there. But the military had totally forgotten what the Mississippians had done there. One of the sources I was most happy to find when I was doing my research was the Marines' official history of Anbar Province in 2005. Doesn't even mention the word National Guard. If you look at the U.S., closest thing we have to an official history now was put out by the War College in a 700-page book, has 20 pages that mention the Guard, mostly to show how the Guard was so bad they shouldn't be used in a similar situation again. One of the reasons we're trying to set up this center is because ain't nobody gonna tell the Guard story. Not the way it's set up now, nobody's gonna tell that story. And somebody needs to. So all this left the Mississippians gobsmacked, as you might suspect, that everything they did, everything they'd done had been forgotten. And then, of course, the regular forces have giant places to tell their story. Fort McNair right down the road here has 14 million documents in it. I sit on their board of advisors. They're doing a really good job, but one of my job on there, it's called the, what's the name of that DAHAS, Department of the Army Historical Advisory Subcommittee. One of the jobs I do on that committee is read the official histories when they come out to make sure they're good. And the last official history they did was on the Vietnam War in 1968. They're a little backlogged. So somebody needs to do it, and that's what we're trying to do. I tried to take the first step in this book, but there's so many more Sean Coolies out there that need their story told. I'll stop here and take any questions you might have. And get some water. Y'all just like my freshman in my class back home. Ain't gonna raise your hand.
Hey, Doctor,
Frank or high water.
Frank McGinn here in the back. So the story is so eerily similar. I was there the same time we were with the 42nd ID, and the medical aid we provided, and we had 2 Vietnam-era pilots that flew in Vietnam that loved the mission. They were going every day, flying into these small villages with docs and nurses and just providing aid. My question is, how many of these other stories do you think are out there, and what is the university's kind of goal? Are they going to try to capture the other ones? We were in MNC North Central at 42nd ID up in Tikrit.
Again, the National Guard troops, I got the numbers in there exactly somewhere, made up about 46% of the U.S. forces on the ground in 2005, suffered about 27% of the casualties that year. The National Guard lost over 500 killed in the response to the global war on terror. So right there are 500 stories that need to be told just for the Mississippi unit on the monument at Camp Shelby. There's over 30 names there for that deployment. So this story is huge, and all those stories deserve to be told. There's no way one person could ever do it. Paul, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, General Stubbs, we briefed him last week at Southern Miss, same thing. I mean, he was there in Baghdad, worked 39th, I believe, with Arkansas. Same thing, same very similar story. Again, the Guard, and we can't blame it all on everybody. It's partially our own fault. We come back from a deployment and everybody dispersed, and there's no concerted effort to really collect, consolidate, and tell our own story. So that's something we've got to get better at, and that's what we hope to do, and help states partner with institutions like Southern Miss. I mean, Mississippi partners with Southern Miss because they have oral historians, they have archivists, they have these tools that can help states partner with them and tell that story and hopefully consolidate it in one archive at Southern Miss. But the way we want to outreach is not necessarily go to Arkansas or whatever and do it for them. The intent of this is to go there and help the states partner with the institutions locally, so those stories can be collected, brought. And then and Andy's the one that told me that historians are lazy, that they like data that's already been collected that they don't have to search for, and that is not the case for the Guard. It is not. It's in 54 states and territories, sometimes in the basements of these places, and in the minds of the soldiers that it's never been collected from. So, hopefully, we can. Be able to get out and do some outreach and bring these states in and do this, sir.
And I would just say, from a historian standpoint, you guys are golden. And what do I mean by that? When I have a young PhD student in who has to write a dissertation, their first book, and why write the 812th book on the Battle of Gettysburg, right? Out there are so many National Guard stories from the beginning, predating the founding of our country all the way up to today. Right now I have two PhD students, one working on the National Guard in World War I, specifically the Pennsylvania 28th Division, and another student working on the transformation of the Guard between World War I and World War II, and how that played out at a little place called Guadalcanal and Kasserine Pass. Both of those were National Guard units. There is so much backstory to tell too. Certainly stories from 05 to 09, all the way up to the closing of the final air base there in Afghanistan. But we can go all the way back to the beginning too.
Honestly, Frank, I'm the worst historian probably that the Army's ever had go through its ranks. Obviously, it's just not my thing, and it never has been. The only reason that I'm a little bit history now is because I've lived long enough to be history. You know what I mean? Outside of that, I really don't care that much for it. Honest to God, I believe there's 500 of these books in the National Guard right now about different units that were dispersed. The problem is finding people like Dr. Wiest a way to go capture that data. There's no place for them to go. I think that we went to this meeting in San Diego that was the military history organization, something, I don't know what it was, but they had huge ballrooms like an August conference of nothing but books, all military history books. Took my breath away, and I was really nervous about going into any of those rooms initially. But once I did, I realized that the number of Guard books represented in that auditorium, literally, you could count on one hand. And when you talk to the historians, the reason is there's no database. There's nowhere for them to go and have a huge amount of data that they can pull in about units from all over the country and write books about it. And that's kind of what this was born out of. And hopefully one day, as this thing develops, there'll be these networks of databases all over the country that some of these universities will participate in. And this is kind of the starting point to help them do that. And they'll all be tied together to where if somebody in Massachusetts wants to include a story about a unit down in Louisiana who happened to be in the same sector at the same time, they can go find that information. So that's kind of what this was all born out of.
And if I could add, and don't forget, there's no place currently that collects Title 32 or state active duty. You got these guys on a mission up here right now, and there's no place in the country that is mandated to collect and preserve the history of what we're doing for wildfires, protection of the cities, hurricanes, state partnerships. All that is nobody does that.
And if you think about just the simple data from even just the surge or anything dealing with Iraq, there's a ton of those informations, the old operations orders, the reports that are still classified, that are still sitting in unit vaults and unit safes in armories all over the country. And at some point in time, we got to figure out a way to go take all that stuff before some really aggressive spec forward decides to clean out the vault, But we got to get all that stuff and gather it up and get it documented and get it in this database somehow.
I mean, that's a really good point. In many ways, we sadly failed our Vietnam generation of soldiers, never adequately telling their stories. And now it's effectively too late. I interviewed a little over 100 guys for my book on Charlie Company in Vietnam, and 40 of them have passed away since I interviewed them. And had I not gotten their stories, they'd be gone. We'd like to think that wonderful folks like General Robinson and Colonel Lyon are youngsters. They're not. This happened over 20 years ago, and the further you get away, the harder these stories are going to be to tell. So we need to jump on this right now, or those stories will be lost. Yes.
This may be redundant of me to ask, but what was the overarching challenge, the greatest overarching challenge you faced with writing this book or other books?
What was the overarching challenge in me writing the book?
Yes, aside from getting the stories.
The chief challenge, again, I knew coming into it that any book this recent was going to have classification issues on documents and things like that. I knew that. It's a great thing about working with people who were a long time ago, because classification is not an issue. To be frank, the military vastly overclassifies stuff right now, making it really difficult for people like me to ever write about it. We're not going to see anytime soon official histories of Iraq and Afghanistan because everything is classified. And you cannot turn that into a publicly consumable book until each one of those little bits is unclassified. What I wasn't ready for was the fact that there was, classified or not, there was no place to go to get to these documents. If I'm writing about an Army unit, it's straight to Fort McNair, maybe it's to the National Archives in College Park, maybe to Carlisle, to the War College. Those are the big three. National Guard ain't got a big nothing. There, it's a void. You don't know where to start. And that was by far the biggest stumbling block, was not having any place to go to get the knowledge I needed, because we'll use both Roy and Paul as examples. Ask Paul. There was that mission on which both he and Roz got hit by an IED, and they both remembered details of that mission very well. And then I'm like, okay, when did it happen? Paul's like, was that in June? And Roz is like, no, that was in August. Or no, wait, it was in May. When you're talking about memories that are over 20 years old, I have a hard time remembering where I ate lunch yesterday sometimes. And now we're talking about people. So that's where you need the documents to make sure. I was so lucky that some of the guys kept journals, which really helped. But even then, it takes a long time to triangulate when one event happened, and there's so many events you got to triangulate. So you need those documents. You got to have them. All the way in the back, yes.
So as a civilian, the story that kind of just surprised me that you told us about the 3 sheiks and the fact of their interaction with the Marines. And just 2 short years earlier, the work of the Mississippians basically erased in the minds of the Marines. Was that an intentional ignorance or true ignorance of the work of the Mississippi?
Ignorance on the part of the sheiks or on the part of the Marines? General, I'm gonna let you, that's above my pay grade. What you weigh in on?
So that was, is it on? So now? So that was unintentional ignorance. So we do Frank knows this better than I do. We do a horrible job of passing along data from one unit when we're ripping out. That's the hardest part. So 2 years later, in a desolate part of Anbar Province, you got, it wasn't just Odierno as you saw there. Petraeus, there's also a picture of Petraeus standing in that same place in Owasat with the headline that says, I guess at that point he was a 3-star. He was standing on ground that had never been stood on by American soldiers, and he was in downtown Owasat. That was Petraeus at the height of his leadership in Iraq. So it's unintentional. It's not like they knew that, but it's kind of a shame on us and shame on everybody involved that we don't do a better job of capturing and handing off that data. You know, we just one little battalion out of Mississippi. You start talking about divisions and all the brigades and all the people that came in and out of there, and the information that if we could have done a better handoff on the front end and the back end, it might have been a much different story. But I don't think it's intentional. I think it's unintentional ignorance.
I'll weigh in here too, to go back to my specialty area of Vietnam. You know, Vietnam War lasted 8 years, and most historians say that it was not an 8-year-long war. It was 8 one-year-long wars, because every time a unit shipped out, a new one moved in and started over. And I fear that probably is also pretty accurate to say about both Iraq and perhaps Afghanistan. And you got to take care. History isn't just old dusty books. History can be something you learn immediately from if you're on top of it. And I would argue that, I would agree with you that since it's never a job won, it's often forgotten.
Sir, thank you very much. I'm Lieutenant Portelli with the Virginia National Guard. I got my BA in history, so this is like a dream for me right here. Now I'm a cyber officer. I don't know what I'm doing. I have a supply and demand question. So the supply of stories, and perhaps guardsmen willing to tell those stories, I imagine it's very high. If you just have at least 1 or 2 really good historians to take that data and compile it. On the demand side, and this might be more of a business question, do we know that there are people who want to hear these stories, or are we also playing a marketing game? Because like I struggle just in my personal life, and I imagine every single junior officer and junior soldier struggles to explain what it is, what the National Guard even is, to our civilian colleagues and classmates. So if we start, in history departments, very aggressively telling civilians, hey, there's a great need and perhaps financially a great benefit to you caring about military history. Is there any hope that they're actually going to get paid to pursue that? Or are we chasing, a pot of gold that we know exists, but it's like, 300 miles away?
That's a great question. The Marines are masters at this. I had a student who now is one of the leads at Project Recover. So he's got a great job and doing great things. His entire dissertation was on the Marines setting up their publicity wing between World War I and World War II. The publicity wing that you see, at Mount Suribachi with the flag raising. Marines are great at tooting their horns, each one of those is a horn tutor, as well they ought to be. The Coast Guard, the Marines, the Army, they all need their horn student. The National Guard does not have one of those. So when we exist, the university has supported us greatly, and it was very revealing when, controversially, the National Guard had to go make some visits to places like, Portland or, California. So when those deployments started rolling in, the phone calls started rolling in, asking us about those deployments in a historical sense. And what we realized was none of these people knew anything beyond the two words National Guard, that they had no idea of the different statuses, they had no idea of the legal background. And let's just put it this way, I've taught a class on U.S. military history for as long as I've taught at our university, and I started teaching there in 1987, so I've been doing that a long time. Even me, a person who does this for a living, knew perilously little about the National Guard until I was forced to learn it, because I wanted to write this book. And y'all are one damn complicated beast, all I got to say. There's still a lot of learning left to do. But one thing we were able to do, again, to begin beating that drum and sounding that trumpet last year, and we were told that, near as we could tell, this was the first time this ever happened at a U.S. university. We taught a collegiate level course just on the history of the National Guard. There is so much there. I think you have to break the logjam into the public mind of perception, but it's historians tilting at windmills like Don Quixote. Maybe that's what we're doing, but I still think it's worth a try. These stories, the fact that nobody knew or cared about somebody like Sean Cooley except for his immediate family and his Guard friends, I find that to be, it's kind of gets my blood boiling, that there are so many stories out there that are ignored, and I'm willing to beat my head against a stone wall to see if we can stop ignoring them. So that's a great question.
Did you say you had a BA in history? Yeah, so we can't be friends, just so you know that going in. But I have zero concern about the demand signals. I'm telling you, this is on us. It's not about, people are clamoring to hear the Guard story because it's so interesting. We're involved in so many different things. Just the response that this was never intended. Honest to God, I told him I really didn't want my name mentioned in there very much. I just was just supportive of the effort. You know what I mean? The demand signal is so strong that if we ever get to the point where we can get 100 or 200 military history professors writing books, I don't think there'll be any question about the people standing in line on the other end to get them and read them. And it can only be a good thing for the National Guard. I had a conversation with the vice, former vice air, Sasseville's here on Saturday. He actually got involved in this on the very front end. We were trying to get everything kind of lined up with the Bureau. We had a couple of lawyers that were a few problems. Went into Sasseville's office. Everything after that went very smoothly. But what will absolutely scare you to death is that Mark Sasseville is such a private person, and he's so humble that he will never tell you the story, the personal account of what he did on 9/11. Now, this guy, he retired as a 4-star vice chief of staff for the National Guard Bureau, and nobody has sat down and really taken an oral history of what he did on 9/11. And he's one of the guys that strapped into a jet and kind of didn't think he would ever come back. And there's a whole story behind that. When I was talking to him about it Saturday, the first thing he said is, you got to remember, the Texas National Guard was 10 minutes behind me. So, I think the demand is great. It's on us. I've tried to set Sasseville up to get the story told. Because most people, did you know that Sasseville did that? Most don't. And we're not built to tell that story about ourselves. So you got to have people that will go out and draw it out of them. And then once you do that, they make for great books. So I think it's there. I think it's a matter of us figuring out how to do our part, you know. And we can be friends. I just the whole history.
And to me, it's an opportunity for folks like us. It's one of the great things a historian loves to do, to discover a document that nobody's ever seen or touched since the last person put it in the box. There's millions and millions and millions of guard documents just like that. So it's a historian's dream. At Southern Miss, we have arguably the top military history program in the country down there called the Dale Center for the Study of War and Society. And again, to give my students access to what we hope becomes, you know, an archive of national standing, where students can go to it and get their National Guard research done as opposed to spread out across the 54. Again, once accessibility is no longer an issue, and there's other strong military history programs all across the country who'd be looking for an opportunity like this in their state. To me, it seems like a perfect place for a private-public partnership between universities that are, again, we want to put students in seats, we want to do good teaching, we want good research coming out, and here's a National Guard that's almost begging for all those things to happen. It just seems like just a natural marriage. So, again, we're happy to be leading the charge on that. We think there's a lot to be done, a lot to be gained. Yes.
Hey, Dr. Wiest. Thank you. Thinking about the other end of presenting the story, I'm thinking about doing the research, and you were kind of an outsider. You weren't in the unit. I'm just wondering, how did you get buy-in from the members, especially the family members, to talk about those hard things? Did you start with one person who was kind of an ambassador, or how'd that work?
I had the same problem with my Vietnam unit, and I would argue even worse with them because their experience with college professors and students was not that good in 1968. But for this unit, even though I wasn't in that unit, I grew up with him. I've known Paul ever since he was by far a worse drummer than me in high school. Worst pool player as well, if I remember correctly. So I've been around these guys, and yes, there's a certain gulf between an academic and, in this case, the soldier. If nobody's telling any stories about the National Guard, at least they're not telling bad ones. So that there is going to be some standoffishness, and it's been my history that you need to work from the top down, because again, the National Guard is still a family. So if I'm calling Soldier X, well, the one under Paul's command is going to call Paul. This guy called me. Is he on the up and up? In fact, I would often bring Paul with me to interviews to soften that particular blow. And if they're not calling Paul, they're calling Roy. So you got to start at the top. You got to, another good connection that everybody knew was the medics. Everybody seemed to know the medics. Everybody seemed to know the platoon leaders. So you got to work your way down from the top. And frankly, just go to their reunions and make sure their Miller Lights don't run out, and that helps too.
Good.
I cannot end with Miller Lite being my last name.
But just one thing too, Andy, you talk about the material. We found, talking with Alabama, with Tennessee, with Michigan, we're doing a project with Michigan. We're going up to Michigan, and they're inviting us up, and we're going to do a whole week dedicated towards the last 10 years. They're bringing in leaders. They're pulling all the documents before we go so we can bring it all back, get it archived for them. But almost every state already has a lot of this. Most states did an oral history program, and there's oral histories just sitting there recorded at the headquarters in some type of format. But unless you get it, consolidate it, archive it, and make it searchable so that it can be usable, it's just going to sit there. And that's where there's plenty out there. I think a lot already been done if we can just get it and archive it.
I was about a year into the research when somebody at Joint Forces Headquarters remembered, oh yeah, we interviewed about 60 of these guys when they came home. And now, the interviews needed to be a little more in depth, but doggone it, it took them, I think, 2 months to find out where they were.
Yeah.
So just getting better at the whole thing.
Thank you, Will.
We have
Free t-shirts if I want one, they come up and get one.
So Doctor, thank you very much. This was an incredible story, incredible work.
Thank you.
Telling the story. Like I said, there are many of these out there. And it's funny how some of the active duty units forget we were there behind them.
Definitely.
And how they do the rip, they get the wheels up guaranteed because they don't want to hear it. They've been there, done that, and it's just, we need to continue telling the story. So thanks for doing. On behalf of August and NGF, just want to present you with this ornament, the picture of Sidney Montgomery.
Oh,
We
wonderful.
all know famous congressman, two-star general from the Mississippi National Guard. And
He commanded this unit.
and his portrait is at the end of our boardroom there. This is a picture of that on our own.
Oh, wonderful.
Thank you so much.